You're listening to the Anthology Towns That Were, an episodic narrative podcast. Follow us on YouTube, twitter.com/townsthatwere, soundcloud.com/townsthatwere, and the Anthology Towns That Were on facebook.com. We hope you enjoy.
The witches they come, and the witches they know. Who has come, and who's to go? Keep an eye on the moon, and both ears to the wall, for I see many things to come through my crystal ball. Jane Little closes the wide book with the torn cover and sets it on the floor next to her. She folds her hands in her lap as the children circled around her look to one another. A silence has fallen over the generally disruptive classroom. Ms. Little lets the children ponder the story for a moment. The girl closest to her on the reading rug, dressed as a witch, scoots a few inches closer, dragging the loosely braided rug with her. Once, most likely a vibrant collection of purples, pinks, and blues, the old rug was here long before Ms. Little began teaching kindergarten. It now unravels in its mixture of pastel colors blended from years of tiny feet running across. The young girl pulls the witching book closer and examines the cover. A large moon resembles the crystal ball, in which she makes out all sorts of festive Halloween scenes. A witch on her broomstick, children dressed as ghosts, and pumpkins running down a street of porch-lit houses. Many of the children in Ms. Little's class were dressed the same as those on the book, and the young girl thought maybe that's why they were all so terrified. The children in those stories misbehaved on Halloween night, disobeying their parents and straying from the path of porch lights and jack-o'-lanterns. Leaving the safety of the town's streets meant their certain doom. As the story went, a woman in black wielding a crystal ball gave them her vision of what was to happen. The witches who watched over town snatched up the disobedient children, taken back with them into the woods, never to be seen again. Ms. Little jumps in the air and imitates her best witch's cackle, sending the children tumbling backwards frightened, before bursting into a contagious laughter. She lunges forward, slow and high like a witch might, and the children scatter around the room. She pokes at a princess, then a ninja, still cackling as the children giggle and chase each other around. Ms. Little tries her best to stay in character, but gives in to a deep-bellied laugh as the children tackle and hug her. She ushers the children to their places, setting up her camera for the fall picture. She scans the children, each pumpkin, ghost, princess, ninja, dog, and cat all accounted for, all except her little witch. The police arrive quickly to Malediction Elementary. Not to say they weren't always quick in their response time, but Daisy Crane had a habit of wandering off. It was rarely anything to be concerned over. The little girl lives in a world of her own imagination, her spots around town where she likes to sit and read. Every time she's been found, she would sigh and bow her head just a little, a guilty expression covering her innocent face, eyes reddening as they welled with tears. No one has ever managed to stay mad at Daisy Crane. Ms. Little repeats this fact over and over to the police. Her hands shake in front of her small frame and tears fall around them as she babbles about how she should have been more firm with Daisy when she would catch her wandering off. That if she would have just scared her enough, she would still be here now. One deputy rests his hand upon Jane Little's shoulder to make sure she focuses completely on him. He tells her they still have more places to check, that they aren't even halfway through Daisy's usual spots. He makes her look him in the eyes, one blue and one green, like Daisy's. Ms. Little gasps, covering her mouth, tears silently streaming down her face, dragging mascara and painted freckles with them. "Forgive me, Mr. Crane," she says. "I didn't recognize you." She stutters more apologies as her throat holds back the sobs bubbling up in her chest. Before she can say more, she scurries off to make sure the other children get back to their families. Luke Crane walks around his daughter's kindergarten classroom. He goes to her desk and opens the top that barely reaches his knees. Inside are books from home that no normal 6-year-old kid would pick themselves, but his did. He gently touches each book, closing his eyes, and pictures Daisy reading them under the willow tree at the park down the street. He can hear her laughing under the little bridge by the creek that fed into Lake Ophelia. He can smell the apples in Ted Austin's orchard, another one of her favorite wandering spots. Officer Crane presses his eyelids with both hands, sealing any premature grief behind them. Opening them, he walks on. He doesn't have to look at the names scrawled on the drawings on the wall to know which is his daughter's. She always draws the same, and he recognizes himself in her art. Taller than the trees behind him, his hair much thicker than in reality, his eyes exaggerated, one green, the other blue. He holds his wife's hand, her hair bright yellow, green eyes equally as bright. She always drew her mother with a blue bow, their matching hair, the color of pollen in spring. The landscape in the background was always different. Sometimes it resembled places they'd been, hiking in the woods around the slag heaps near Kingsfield Road, or on the lake in New York just after sunrise. Sometimes it was a magical place she'd read of in one of her books, a mountainous home for dwarves or a castle filled with magical items. Luke moves on. He had been avoiding the spot she went missing. He had been avoiding her hat, unexplainably torn. He walks slowly to the reading rug, still scrunched from the weight of Daisy scooting closer to Miss Little. He kneels down at first, but suddenly sits with his legs intertwined, like he imagined Daisy would have. He reaches to touch her hat, but hesitates, and opts for the book instead. He remembers this one, the same book that had terrified him as a young boy. He remembers how he refused to let go of his mother's hand that night while trick-or-treating, how he was the most polite he'd ever been in his short life for fear of being taken by the witches of malediction. Daisy hadn't inherited that fear. She insisted on dressing as a witch. Daisy feared very little. She was much like her mother in that fashion, fearless to a fault and stubborn. Luke Crane cradles the book against his chest. He closes his eyes and can nearly feel his baby in his arms. She had wandered off before, many times. Daisy had spots that she liked to go close to school and near their house. He'd gotten the call this morning at 10:30 a.m. It was now near 1 p.m. For 2.5 hours, every able-bodied person in town went to one of her wandering spots. She wasn't at any. He had told Ms. Little they weren't even halfway through, but that was a lie. By now, the entire town had been searched. They say the first 48 hours are crucial in this type of situation, but here, in Malediction, every hour was crucial. For his daughter, every second. He could hear them call out spots over his radio, followed by a check to indicate they had been thoroughly searched. Everyone in town knows of his daughter, her need to wander. They all looked out for her. Luke received calls from his neighbors, shop owners, trashmen, dog walkers, and the old woman who lived a mile from the Graysons' cabin in the woods weekly. They kept their eyes out for Daisy every day. Someone always knew where she was, and in turn, Luke knew as well. Today was different. Today, 2.5 hours had gone by, and not a single soul in Malediction could tell him where his baby girl is. His grief no longer felt premature, and anger struggled to take its place. He clenches the book hard, pressing it firmly against his chest to steady his breathing. If he'd only been more firm with his daughter, only encouraged her to understand and feel fear, she might still be here. Ms. Little's words echo through his head, but he knows her guilt is misplaced. The only one to feel guilty should be him. He feels his body quake in anger, but before his emotions take hold, a familiar voice comes over the radio. Rayla. He quickly grabs hold of the device. There were 5 deputies and the sheriff in town, working together on everything from fires to bar disputes. They'd all walk the streets at night checking on the peace that rarely came. They were a team, but every team has a leader, and theirs is Rayla. Hearing her voice subsides the pain in his chest. He knows that if anyone can find his daughter, it was her. Rayla orders Deputy Crane home to be with his wife. She needs you, she tells him. She speaks with authority. In some way, it still feels like advice. Luke responds with a simple check, the fear that staying would reveal more misery. He places the book gently where he found it, glances again at the pieces of Daisy's hat. He can't take his eyes off it as he rises to his feet. Standing over it, he feels for the first time as tall as Daisy draws him. He leans down and picks up the piece of the witch's hat. It feels heavy in his hand, not like the cheap cloth his wife fashioned a few nights ago when Daisy announced, in her most stubborn voice, that she refused to be a princess. Only a witch would do. It's smooth in his calloused fingers and radiates a smell too familiar. He brings the fabric to his nose and breathes in. Smoke. He confirms it isn't the same felt, like the yards stretched out on his dining room table. It's made of leather. He clenches it in a fist and shoves it into his jacket pocket, motioning to a fellow deputy to mark the area on the floor for when Rayla arrives, as he heads out the door to find Daisy Crane. Rayla slams the door to her cruiser and lets her head fall back against the headrest. She sighs heavily. She wasn't prepared for something like this. Malediction had prepared her for a lot more than she'd ever bargained for. She'd be the first to admit. This, however, was too close to home. She can't imagine looking Deputy Crane in the eye if they didn't find his daughter. But she knows she can't think that way. Rayla turns on her engine, the headlights cutting through the light drizzle that had started amidst the cool autumn day, and she watches as Malediction Elementary fades into the rearview mirror. 8 years, she thinks to herself. 8 years as Sheriff Taylor's deputy, and she's never felt so torn apart. She tries to convince herself that, with all she's seen, she can handle this. She can handle anything. Even the dark secrets she's learned of her hometown in the last year don't compare to this. She'll find Luke's baby girl, she promises herself, even if she has to up and leave Malediction for good. Rayla parks her cruiser in the confined parking space on Main Street and turns off her lights, realizing she's been blinding those sitting in the window front seat of the Kalita coffee house. She's heard tales of Daisy's adventures, her wandering, nearly a daily update from Luke back at the station, though she's never once seen her wandering through the town, not like so many of the other townsfolk have. Rayla uses this to lessen the guilt of her pit stop. You're not wasting time, she convinces herself. You're checking your route. No harm there. Swinging open the door to Kalita's, the reflection reminds Rayla of the black cat outfit she wears, the same as every Halloween. Her stomach drops. Had she really worn a Halloween outfit to the school? Interviewed the teachers and parents in such attire? None of them had mentioned it, or treated her any differently. Maybe they were used to Rayla's yearly tradition. Perhaps a little normality was a good thing in such a situation. Inside, she finds that she's not alone in her festive nature. A unicorn sits across from her cowboy companion, both sipping at their steaming drinks. In the corner of the shop, a big game hunter sits in a red leather chair, one leg crossed over the other, reading a novel in peace. Some of the patrons even smile to Rayla. One acknowledges her by name. She forces a smile, nodding back. None of them yet know of the missing girl in their quiet town, and Rayla envies them. What would it be like to live such a life, oblivious to the terrors of the real world? But she decided to give up on her chance of that life years ago. She has a responsibility now to remain in the center of those terrors, for these naive townsfolk, for Malediction, and for the Crane family. The line before her slowly shortens as Rayla gets lost in her head, hoping to be sharply awoken from her thoughts as one of her fellow deputies chimes through the radio attached to her leather belt. A sharp contrast, as with the holstered gun, from the tail extending off the back of the belt. But the radio remains silent. She adjusts the volume for the nth time, reassuring herself that she won't miss their calls if they come. The man before checks his watch as many times as she had her radio. Late returning from his lunch break, she assumes. As he leaves, Rayla grabs her black coffee, feeling the warmth soak through the cup, warming her black gloves. She forces out one last smile as the cashier denies Rayla's offer to pay, as she does every day. Turning to leave, she nearly spills her coffee over the man behind her, stopping herself just in time, apologizing fiercely. Absolutely not, James Grayson says, critiquing Rayla's outfit. I am not participating, he says. You don't like it? She asks. James's somewhat irritating humor momentarily dissipating the fear boiling in her stomach. He admires her costume, from the black-eared headband fixed on her head, the whiskers painted quickly upon her cheeks, down to her black cargo pants to match the curving tail affixed to her deputy's belt. Rayla waits while James pays for his coffee, and he sits with her at the small table adjacent the unicorn and her cowboy companion. He can see the darkness beneath her eyes, unmasked by the face paint lining them. She notices as James studies her, seeing a look of concern wash over him. She can feel the lump in her throat expanding, her eyes welling a dam on the verge of collapse. James begins to reach across the table, instinctively thinking to grab her hand, instead grabbing his coffee. She carefully wipes her eyes, avoiding the painted whiskers. She recounts her morning, Daisy's disappearance, and her dread for talking with Luke Crane. She does her best to keep her voice down, but her words are unsteady, her breath strained, and she can see the couple across from her and James leaning in and whispering to one another. James watches as she covers her mouth, her eyes widening. "Where haven't you checked?" he asks quickly, stealing her attention away from the spies next to them. "Everywhere," she snaps, breathing deep as she leans back in her chair. "You said she loves to read," James continues, in an attempt to pry past the emotions that have entwined themselves around her judgment. "Let's go check out the bookstore." She denies him, mutters a slurry of reasons as to why he doesn't need to get involved, all incoherent. "Everyone else is helping," James says. He grabs her hand and helps her to her feet, grabbing their coffees. "I can lend a hand, so long as I don't have to wear the uniform," he says, mocking her costume once more before they leave the Kalita coffee house. Rayla shivers as the bell chimes above the door to Fireside Books shuts heavily behind her. The cool air reminds them that winter is approaching quicker than they think, and the heat from the trembling vents is rewarding. The cash wrap is empty, other than the piles of books littering the counter, sporadic pieces of newspapers lining the empty spaces. Stacks of magazines from every era stand like a city skyline on the floor behind the register, leaving room only for the tall stool standing empty. The store is uncomfortably silent. The only noise the rattling of air vents overhead, and James fights the urge to let a quick hello echo through the seemingly empty store, having seen one too many horror movies to know how that ends. He breaks away from Rayla, walking slowly down the aisles, browsing the misplaced books collecting dust and cobwebs. Fitting for Halloween, he thinks to himself. But he cringes at the thought of what built those thin webs, knowing they're no decorations. He lets his fingers slide against the spines of the books, noting rather quickly that there seems to be no order to the novels that line the shelves. Aunt Gloria would have had a heart attack, he thinks, knowing the clutter alone would have killed her. He can't imagine her reaction seeing the store, knowing beyond any shadow of a doubt that she'd visited the store when it opened. She wouldn't pass up a bookstore under any circumstance. Perhaps, at one time, the shop was clean, organized. Maybe when the chaos of malediction died down, James could lend a helping hand to the poor soul that ran the small shop. That is, if he were crazy enough to stay in town, and he doubted something would change his mind on the matter. He calls out for Rayla, but returning to the front of the store, lit only by the light of the overcast sky intruding through the small windows, she decided not to wait around while he wandered. Instead of meandering in circles, James peruses through the mess upon the cash wrap. A sense of disgust pours over him, digging through someone else's belongings, but he figures the crucial circumstance dictate his actions. He rummages through the notebook filled with a handful of recent transactions, miscellaneous books purchased through the week. The page lessens his surprise with their lack of service, recognizing how slow the store is in a town such as Malediction. Finding nothing of note, he loses interest quickly. James navigates the labyrinth of randomly placed books, surprised as the back of the store opens into a room nearly twice the size of the initial shop. From Main Street, no one would notice how deep the store was, finding themselves lost within a never-ending cavern of mysteries and adventure. In the center of the back room, an off-center staircase winds down through the floor, the metal banisters the only thing separating James from the floor below. The extension below appears to be more of the shop, a few randomly placed bookshelves placed awkwardly in the room, as if it were once nothing more than a storage room for the bookstore. A light dances from behind the stairs he'd recently descended. "Hello?" he speaks, quickly covering his mouth, but the word had already spilled out. He knows he's already fallen prey to whatever lurks around the corner. Slowly putting one foot lightly before the other, the stairs behind begin to clear before him. He can see a figure, dressed in black, seated at the table, the shadows from a candle's light bouncing across her face. "Rayla," he sighs, "what are you doing down here?" As he approaches, he notices another woman seated across the table, older than Rayla, though her age is hard to determine. The wrinkles in her face clash with the vibrance of her eyes, the starkness of her black hair held up in a frizzy bun by a black and white handkerchief. Before her sits a deck of cards, spread in an impressive half circle around a crystal ball in the center of the table, dazzling stars swirling within. James runs his fingers through his hair, longer than it's been in quite some time. He wonders if he's the only soul in this town not in costume. He wants to remind Rayla they don't have time for this, for the shopkeeper's games. He fights the urge to drag her from the store and return to their search for the missing girl, until he realizes that it's not him that's fighting that urge. Instead, an urge far more powerful draws him towards the table, mesmerized by the display spread out before them. He breaks his focus from the woman, watching Rayla as she rests her chin on her hands, captivated by the woman. The teller ushers James to sit, grunting airily as he takes his time. The wooden chair whines against the floorboards, startling him, but he quickly sits, unfazed by the urgency that consumed him only moments before. Maybe she knows something, he tries to convince himself. Maybe I know something. The thought jumbles in his head. Maybe something here knows me. And when she speaks, James knows nothing. Not himself, not the young woman dressed as a black cat on Halloween sitting beside him, nor where he is or why he's there. With certainty, James knows the stars swirl within the orb. The cards circle like a thick atmosphere, waiting to tell him the things he no longer knows, the things he never knew, the things that others meant to tell him before they lost their chance. She speaks of an eternity of solitude, loneliness, of a certain claustrophobic life left to rot beneath the floorboards of her childhood home, of a dwindling essence searching for power, honing in on the one thing that can keep it from fading like a ripple in the middle of the ocean, never to be seen again. Amidst her words, she reveals a card from around the orb. Death, she breathes the word. Though the rider upon the black horse drawn marvelously on the card is indeed ominous, the way in which she speaks the single word is that of relief. Change is coming, she tells them. In a manner of speaking, change has already come, finding itself unwillingly in our small town, forced to stay by unthinkable methods. Rayla eyes James for the first time since he arrived in the bookstore's dank basement. He knows what runs through her head. He thinks the same. The snap of a card against the table pulls James and Rayla back to the old woman. A tower, rising high into the sky, unfortunate souls falling from its flaming windows. The tower, she confirms. Home of a ruler, not yet seen, fighting for control over what it once lost. She looks to Rayla, then to James, her eyes golden and fiery. The seal has been broken. A sacrifice amidst the altar has been made. Its opening is growing. She quickly slides the card to the side, pulling one final card from the orb's atmosphere. This time, she hesitates, closing her eyes and breathing deep, a crooked smile forming in the corners of her lips, as if to show that she already knows what lies face down before her. The Hanged Man, she snickers. James is nearly certain the card hadn't been flipped when she spoke the words, but as he looks down at the table, he sees the thin man hanging upside down from one foot, seemingly complacent in his inability to escape captivity. A thread, the teller states. An entire town, an entire culture hanging by a thread. And though a thread can be replaced, its name never changes. She looks to James one final time and asks, "But how long will it hold?" The sun is set as James and Rayla burst out into the cold night of downtown Malediction. "How long were we in there?" Rayla asks. James studies their surroundings, walking quickly in the night's rainfall. 30 minutes, he says. No more than that. But Rayla eyes the night sky, not needing to remind him that the world surrounding them strongly contradicts his answer. Rayla's cruiser doors slam shut, one after another, and she quickly checks in on her radio. "No news yet," Darla's voice crackles back from the other end. "You just checked in 10 minutes ago, hun. We'll find her. Don't worry." 10 minutes, Rayla thinks, shooting a confused glance towards James. Rayla pulls quickly out into the lane of the slowly flooding Main Street, reminding James that she was supposed to check in with the Cranes hours ago. The house of Luke and Bella Crane is a small ranch set back on the opposite side of Lake Ophelia, just far enough to be out of view of the waters. Rayla pulls into the short gravel turnaround drive, throwing her cruiser into park and hopping out of the car. James wonders whether he should wait. He assumes no parent would mind another pair of helping hands in a situation that they find themselves in today, but he feels wrong tagging along behind Rayla. He finds himself standing at her side when she rings the doorbell. Luke greets them. His skin has gone pale, reflecting in the moonlight. Rayla apologizes as Luke leads them into the living room, seating them on the couch across from his wife. Luke sits beside Bella, his eyebrows contorting. "It's only been 3 or 4 hours since you were here," he says. "You two are doing as much as anyone." He proceeds to ramble about how he cares not in the slightest for anyone's feelings of James returning to town. While he speaks, James watches Rayla, hoping she can read the thoughts going through his mind. The thoughts of never having met Luke and Bella in his life, yet somehow, he'd been precisely where he sits now only hours before. When Luke asks if they've made any progress, James stumbles through his words. "We're looking anywhere and everywhere," he finally gets out. Luke lights his electric fireplace after a few moments of silence. When Bella returns with coffee, James graciously takes a torrid mug in his hands, still tasting the coffee from Khalidah's on his breath. The coffee he'd had somehow 45 minutes and 10 hours ago. As he holds the mug in his hands, the heat flowing through his arms like an electric current, he feels dizzy, closing his eyes and steadying his breathing. Bella sips harshly from her mug, setting it down with a clank on the glass coffee table. She whispers, "We should tell them," to her husband, keeping her head low. Rayla scoots to the edge of the sofa, like a roller coaster jolting forward before descending the steepest decline. "You should tell us," she agrees blindly. "It's nonsense," Luke spits, reaching for his wife as she stands, though she moves too quickly for him to pull her back to her seat. Bella skirts around the coffee table, moving gracefully between the furniture. She removes an old framed photograph from the wall before returning to her seat. She lays it on the coffee table between them, turning it to face James and Rayla. As they lean in, James watches Luke palm his face, seemingly embarrassed, but as James inspects the photo, a quaint cabin stares back at them. The photo is black and white, looking almost marvelously hand-drawn. 3 young ladies sit on the front porch, wearing matching black gowns, posing joyously for the picture. "My ancestors," Bella explains. She retells the stories her grandmother told her as a child. The reclusive barn on the edge of Lake Ophelia. The visitors from deep within the lake. The voices from the woods. The fiery pyres that illuminated the quiet nights. "It's nothing," Luke enforces. Stories her grandmother told her. But Bella hears nothing her husband says. "Witches," she says, "here in Malediction, in our family." Rayla snatches the photo, rising to her feet. "Your family has a cabin here in Malediction, and we haven't searched it yet." Her face flushes red with anger. Luke assures her that it was Bella and his first stop after he left Malediction Elementary earlier in the day. "The place is abandoned and rotting," he says. "I was surprised we didn't find any gypsies hiding out in the basement." Though Luke mocks his wife's stories, the words click with James and Rayla. Luke is taken aback, confused as to why his jest sparked a mutual thought between the two seated across from him. "Get up," Rayla commands, pulling Luke by the arm. "We're going back for a second look." The vivid numbers on Rayla's dash strike midnight as she kills the engine. James's boots sink into the mud beneath the forest of weeds covering the overgrown driveway. As he fights against the suction, he finds something misshapen protruding from the mud. The Witching Book. He reads the title in his head. Luke and Bella follow behind Rayla as she approaches the relinquished shack. He feels lost in time, seeing the cabin from the photo, an exact representation of the hand-drawn image he'd seen an hour before. As if time itself has reverted, he can nearly see the 3 women dressed in black seated on the warped porch steps. He studies the book once more, before tossing it into Rayla's cruiser. The last thing they need is for Luke and Bella to lose self-control. He's seen what malediction can do, knows how it likes to prey on those disoriented by its senseless actions. Rayla swings the creaking door open cautiously, raising a finger as Bella begins to call out for her daughter. Daisy's mother questions Rayla's concern, and though Rayla has no doubt Bella would be open to her and James' recently discovered oddities of the town, that's not a door she wishes to open. Not in the midst of a day ruled by the town itself. In the foyer, James is the first to feel the draft, heavier than the winds underlying the rain outside the cabin. The first to smell the lilies permeating the confinements of the shack. He points to a door placed between 2 hallways, open like a hungering mouth, leading down an unlit stairwell to the belly of the shack. "The 2 of you stay put," Rayla says coldly, slowly unholstering her sidearm. She ignores the guilt that rises within her, seeing Bella Crane wince at the sight, still uncomfortable around a firearm after all the years beside her husband. She ignores the fury that besets Luke, only able to imagine the desire to be the one to descend those stairs, praying for his daughter to be curled in a damp corner, lost in her strange novels. James nearly forces his way past Luke, knowing the man fights every urge to stop him from following Rayla. Though the walls seem to close in on James as he's halfway down before realizing he'd even touched the banister. An overpowering stench fills the dingy basement. The underlying smell of lilies now so powerful it's no longer pleasant. Studying the basement, so intact compared to the rest of the house, it's uncanny, James crashes into Rayla, frozen in place before him. She stands a few feet from the table nearly identical to that which they sat around in the basement of the bookstore. The teller's orb has been replaced with Daisy Crane, lying on her back upon the table, her eyes gently closed, her fingers twitching sporadically, as if she's locked within some terrible nightmare. The half-moon spread of tarot cards, lying face down, borders the young girl's head like a dark halo. The woman with golden eyes looks up to James and Rayla, the corners of her lips curling. "Your timing couldn't be more appropriate," she says. Rayla keeps her pistol pointed towards the ground, not moving with the girl so close to the defect of malediction. James feels the heavy weight wash over him as it did in the basement of the cobwebs and forgotten texts. He steps past Rayla, feels her firm grip on his arm, but he pulls away with no effort, no control. "Stop me," he thinks, but the words stay trapped inside. He sits at the table, hearing Rayla's voice as she calls softly to him, muffled and distant. His body now a puppet to the woman, to malediction, to something greater and more vile than himself. He finds his eyes the last in his control, moving them awkwardly to view his surroundings, feels his heart beat faster and faster, until he can feel it beating in his temples. Rayla knows she has no time left to waste. She commands the golden-eyed woman to let go of the girl, but she declines, standing slowly from the table. With a delicate wave of her slender nails, Daisy Crane rises, lying motionless at least a foot off the table. She doesn't stir. In fact, the twitching of her fingers slows. When Rayla finds herself lost within the teller's eyes, she understands, as if the golden-eyed woman invited Rayla inside. Rayla knows the woman's struggles, the sacrifices she made for her family, the sacrifices she made when her family was gone. She knows of the countless witches throughout the centuries, unlucky enough to be birthed in malediction, prey to the woman before her, living out multiple lifetimes, awaiting the return of the only thing she has left. She knows that as long as the young witch that floats before her resides in malediction, the golden-eyed woman has essence enough for another lifetime of patience here in malediction. Seeing Daisy Crane motionless before her, Deputy Rayla Marsh slowly releases the safety on her pistol. James Grayson stands in a field, the husks of corn scattered amongst his feet, dried brown soil like waves frozen in motion. The world around him is blurry, as if he's in a living water painting, the winds of the town moving each hue of color like a flag blowing in the wind. In the sky above, an ellipse white as canvas stares back at him, as far as the eye can see. An opening that welcomes him, encourages him to spread his arms and surrender himself. It's an opening that lusts for the freedom of returning to the land below, hungering for the feast of chaos it once held in its hands, taken away by something only remembered in the hatred of what lingers. hanging over the town of Malediction, waiting for its moment of return, of remembrance, of redemption. James feels time turn back decades with each step closer the golden-eyed woman takes, her knee-high, black boots destroying the fertile grounds beneath her careless step. Her arms wisp away as she takes the shape of the vengeful figure of smoke that attacked Rayla in her house. Her face melts in the vibrance of the white space above, as with the next step, she's the man lying face down in the woods. A woman in white, trembling in fear from the dark voices calling to her on her wedding day. Her eyes fade to black static, and she stares at him confused as to why he's not the one it searches for, why he's not Rayla. Her shoulders tremble, and Reverend Dyer's thin mustache curls with the grimace on his lip. Gloria Grayson reaches to her nephew, her eyes swollen and red. "Cut the thread, Jameson," she whispers. The arms that James had so recently found locked against his sides now hold a state-issued pistol, and against all restraint, his hand squeezes. The chaotic winds spiral furiously around James, the blank space above him now quaking. For a moment, he can see something large as the sky itself, dark as a fleeting shadow, pass through the opening. Gloria Grayson clutches at her stomach, and she falls back, her eyes returning to their wicked golden purity. And the woman whose hair was once black, now gray against her speckled handkerchief, topples backwards. In the basement of the Crane's shack, James Grayson's hands are empty and shaking. At his feet lay a golden-eyed woman, though her skin is gray and wrinkled, the time that she'd stolen for so long ripped away from her in an instant. He hears Rayla's gun fall to the ground, feels her wrap her arms around him, unaware that he was even falling to his knees, and the woman before them seeps through the cracked floorboards of the cabin like a pile of dust. Luke and Bella Crane reluctantly leave Daisy's side as she lays conscious, though unspeakably confused, in the back of the ambulance parked next to Rayla's cruiser. Bella Crane sobs into Rayla's shoulder, muttering a million thank yous. Luke mentions the gunshot, curious as to what unfolded in the basement where Daisy had been found. Rayla no longer questions her decisions, explaining what unfolded beneath their feet in a manner too casual to feel real. "You should listen to your wife more," she says. "Most things are usually more than stories in this town." The Cranes share a nervous glance. "Why Daisy?" Luke asks, not sure he wants an answer. And though Rayla is unsure she wants to provide the answer, she does. "Some things just run in the family," she says, looking to Bella, then to her ancestral cabin. "But she's gone, right?" Bella asks. "The woman?" So many years hearing her grandmother's tales of the house, its history, and she can't bring herself to utter the word witch. "So long as she has what will keep her alive," Rayla answers, "she may never be gone." She turns the Cranes back towards the ambulance, preparing to take their daughter away. "Let her rest," Rayla says, "then get out of Malediction, as far away as you can go."
The anthology, Towns That Were, is written by Michael and Jackie Gormley, narrated by Michael Gormley. Music and sound from David Hyde, Free to Use Sounds, The Dark Piano, Purple Planet Music, and Our Music Box.